Today's episode brings together two people whose work has helped shape Gibraltar in different ways, but who actually have a great deal in common. Both have spent decades in public service. Both have worked on some of the most important infrastructure issues facing Gibraltar, and both know what it means to keep things moving, often under pressure, often behind the scenes, and often without much fuss. One has spent a career thinking about the physical shape of Gibraltar, its buildings, its heritage, its public spaces, but also its story and how we present ourselves to the world. The other has spent his working life at the operational end of things, the airport, the frontier, security, logistics, and the systems that have to function every single day, no matter what is happening. In a way, this episode is about the structures without, but also about the structures within. The visible infrastructure we all use and move through, but also the internal structures that matter just as much. Experience, leadership, teamwork, judgment, and that public service mission to get on with the job and keep things moving every single day. Between them, these are two people who have seen Gibraltar change enormously over the years and who have each played a part in that change. So this is a conversation about infrastructure, yes, but also about service, responsibility, and the people who quietly help hold Gibraltar together. Welcome to Not Another Press Release. Terence, welcome to Not Another Press Release. We've been doing a lot of meetings lately here at Number 6, getting ready for the big deadline that was looming. How has that rush been to meet this crazy deadline that we all had sort of hanging over our heads?
It's nothing simple in the aviation world, and to be honest, it's not uncommon that we have to work to deadlines because the aviation industry is such that you need to respond quite quickly. I always compare it to like a West End show, which has a matinee in the morning and 2 or 3, and you have to have the same production 3 times a day and then restart and then restart and then restart. So there's no continuity. So if something happens and you need to react to it, you've got hours to react to it before the next flight, before the next morning. We tendered for new security equipment at the end of last year, and we didn't know that the moment we were told the equipment is coming and you need to set it up, we also had the deadline that we had to meet with regards to the EU treaty. So it's been extremely madness and the 9.5 hours in the day. And thanks to a very good team that I work with and we're delivering at all levels, we've got through it quite well. But it's not uncommon. It has been very hectic, but it's not uncommon.
And the deadline is always the next flight, I imagine.
Correct.
Flight arrival where things have to work.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I always tell people, if you want to get into this world, you need to watch the news in the morning. There could be this volcano in Iceland nobody can pronounce and you don't really care. But the next thing you know, flights are not moving and you have a terminal full of people. Or it could be just the weather or world events. Similar now, they're talking about diversions and disruptions because of weather pattern. All of this has an effect. So you just need to be ready for the next one. You have to think ahead, a lot of thinking ahead.
So in the new post-Brexit deal arrangements, the airport is going to become not only the central hub for transport in Gibraltar, but also where all the entry and exit into Schengen is going to happen. Like, would you say that this has been the biggest challenge that you faced from a sort of infrastructure perspective since you joined took on this role?
Apart from opening the terminal originally, we've been through remember, I've been there since 1989, so there has been a whole lot of issues and in occasions where we had to rise and deliver on exactly the same deadlines, from expanding the old terminal where it was, to putting in new security equipment post-Lockerbie, to then issues to do with the frontier and the Cordoba agreement. It's always been a challenge. I don't think I've had more than 2 or 3 years waiting for something to happen. It's always been something coming our way. This has been the biggest one because the brief we were all given, as was everybody in Gibraltar, was that we were up against the EES system. And if we failed to deliver for the EES system, it was the cliff, top scenario where it would affect the economy, it would affect everything else. So it wasn't led by aviation or anything like that. It was led with a gigantic social economic problem for Gibraltar. And we couldn't wait for things to happen. We had to be ahead of them, because if we did not deliver on time, and the EES came in, and we weren't ready, there was a very good chance we may be left out, and that would have been chaos. And there was no chance that was going to happen.
So I've started talking about the latest challenges that we've been sort of facing together here as a team, but I also would like to go back to your origins and talk a little bit about where your background is and how you sort of started in this career path. No? So what is your background? Where do you come from?
I've been a public servant all my life, one way or another. When I left school, it was the old A-level days when you had to get points to go to university, and I never got enough points to get there, but I got my 3 A-levels, and I got a job. In those days, I was working in the public sector, but in the dockyard, as a clerk, as a CA or something like that in those days. And I moved across to the government of Gibraltar when the frontier opened for vehicles in 1885, I think that was. And I started work at the Department of Labour and Social Security. That was when people started coming over for pensions, people started coming over to work permits. So there was the origins of employment and what we called labour in those days. And after a few years there, I moved across to the audit department, worked a year there with my colleague Jimmy Bosso, who used to work at the DLSS and then moved, became the principal auditor eventually. Did that for about a year and a half maybe, and the opportunity arose to join a joint venture company. This was back in 1989, I think it was. And it was the first time that government departments started becoming slightly privatized, if you like. So the first joint venture company I started working for was Gibraltar Airport Services Limited. It's a joint venture between airports, British Airport Authority in the United Kingdom and the government of Gibraltar. We did that for a few years. That wasn't working the way it was supposed to have worked, so we did like a management takeover, and I started working for Terminal Management Limited, and I stayed there all the way through till 2021, which is when I was transferred across back into the public sector. So even though I wasn't working as a civil servant, I was working for the public. It was a service industry. And along that time, I spent about 15, 16 years on shift work, doing what my duty managers do now. We were responsible for security at the terminal, aviation security, not just opening and closing doors, the full whack, X-ray, you name it. And then immigration. The origins of Borders and Coast Guard Agency was the Security Immigration Limited. And we kicked that off, and we started doing immigration at the entry points, which was the airport, reporting berth, and the East Gate. And then eventually, in 95, we took over at the frontier. And then come 21, I was sidelined into Gibraltar Terminal Limited as the head of operations. And shortly after that, my CEO, Nigel Guerrero, moved back to the tourist board, and I got the whole hog. So apart from doing operational work, I also had transferred into administration, admin, HR, finance, all of that, whilst I worked at the old terminal. So victim of circumstance, really, because I found myself, you could say, in the wrong place at the wrong time, because I could tackle most of the problems that were coming our way. I still am qualified for aviation security, for compliance, so I can write things and do processes and quality control and assurance, all that stuff. So it's just become progressively more and more and more.
Yeah. Sounds to me more like the right guy for the job than the wrong place, wrong time.
Not sure about that, as the family. Towards 2014-ish, when Airport Fire and Rescue was coming off being the old fire section for the Ministry of Defence, and they were becoming fully fledged Airport Fire and Rescue Service, I went across as their CEO. They are very ably led and very ably manned. I don't have a daily operational role with them. We speak every day, and we constant contact, and I take an active part in a lot of what they do. But that's also on the portfolio. And then when Kingsway came along, seeing that their control room was in our terminal, and seeing that it was on our patch, northernmost part of Gibraltar, which included the expanding civilian footprint on what was a very, very military area. Yeah. Slowly it became more civilianized as land was handed over. I took strategic oversight for Kingsway too, and I got very good people there who run it on a daily basis, and they're there 24 hours a day and react to everything that goes on, maintenance, you name it. So it slowly got bigger and bigger and bigger. Having the opportunity to mesh all of those together with the common ground of using the public service as the base, so that instead of having individual entities like the terminal, fire and rescue, Kingsway, bring them all together, and then bring in all the different agencies that we work with, Borders and Coast Guards, etc., into what we call interoperability has helped a lot, because being the only person in charge meant that everybody did what I told them. But more importantly, there's a common theme, there's a common line. Yeah, we need to deliver, and these are the way we do things, and it works. And you just empower your people who work for you, and you support them as much as you can, and they deliver. They deliver every day, and it works. I think it does.
I think it would be interesting, because before we go into detail of what you're talking about right now, which I'd like to do later, I think your career, which is long and sort of spans over different social, political changes, different departments within the civil service, in the sort of civil service proper, but also in these like semi-private enterprises. I would like to hear what you think about how the civil service and public work and the government in general has changed over the years, and how have you seen this evolve?
Originally, it was very much the red bits of paper go in that box, the yellow ones go in that box. You just need to staple that corner, and you put it in an envelope. This is the way you stick it, and that's the way it was. And it was very mundane, very droll, there was not enough opportunities to improve or to improve on the systems. Many of them were archaic. Many of them were based on whatever had existed, because that's the way it's done for the last 20, 30 years. Yeah. I recall when we were very, very involved in COVID at the beginning, and we used to meet here at number 6 and started discussing, for example, right, let's find out where can we send our older folk to do some exercise. Okay, we need a heat map that shows where they live. And everybody had different addresses, because it's incredible how in Gib we all supply our address for everything that we do, and all of those records were separate. So you may have changed along your life address a couple of times, but it hasn't caught up with you depending on which department you're dealing with. And I think a lot of that has changed now. A lot of that is a lot more modern. I am a dinosaur. I am from another planet. So I still think that you need to have very basic values and keep to them. And I have a lot of time for people trying to improve who they are and what they do and the likes of that, but I have very little time for abuse. I have very little time for people who abuse the system. And it's unfortunate, but something that has to be mentioned is that the abusers still get away with constantly not doing what they're supposed to be doing, whereas before that was a bit more harsh. Okay. So possibly trying to find the middle road for that. Yeah? It shouldn't be as harsh as it was then, but some of the areas we deal with are still quite lack.
You mean that in terms of how we manage human resources, by the modern paradigms of how to manage staff, sometimes we're a bit too soft on workers? Is that what you think?
You've got to be, you're only as good as the people who work for you. And forgive me, but I take a lot of, I served for some time in the TA of the Gibraltar Regiment, and I've carried a lot of those values with me forever, because they're very basic, very basic principles that when you take that type of advice, they have served in war. So if they work in war, they're obviously going to work when there's no war. And if you empower your commanders and you keep at them, and you support them and you do what they're supposed to do, your other ranks will come with you. And I don't want it to sound as draconian as it may seem. You've got to have a modern relationship with your staff. You've got to be flexible with them. You've got to, and they will come and go, and they will. And by far, most of what you get is positive. But unfortunately, when the element of control dilutes a bit, when you have bigger, if you like, staff with less supervision, the supervisors possibly are not as motivated as you were then. Before you used to get a promotion and you had to be fit for the promotion. Nowadays, promotion is there, but maybe the leadership, you can be a manager, not a leader.
Yeah.
These little elements, and you can teach as much as you want, but some people will carry it with them for life and some people won't. Yeah. And there where you try and motivate, this is what you need to try and do. And for some people it's very easy, for some people it's very difficult. And it bothers me when there's an abuse of the positive sides of it. I'm all for the positive sides of it. The well-being, I'm all for that. But I have very little time when that's abused, if you know what I mean. I don't want it to sound harsh or draconian, just realistic.
I understand. I mean, I think that it's probably also reflective of the way society has changed in general. No? Like we live in a society now that looks more to the welfare of the individual and protects, the individual's needs in a much more diverse and open-minded way.
That, I mean, for example, I won't mention Airport Fire and Rescue because they're very, like all the other fire and rescue services, they're very much into their health and safety, and it's what they do every day. They're looking after their lives. But the airport can be a very dangerous environment, and you want people to have the proper, the proper PPE on, and wearing ear defenders and all of that, and that's essential. And that culture has to exist, and has to be adhered to specifically every day. You can't have. It would be a tragedy if we'd ever had an accident airside, and these occur every day in every part of the world. We've never had one, touch wood. So elements of this are very important. It's just when this gets diluted slightly is where I lose the plot a bit. Yeah. And I want to know, well, where are we going with this? What are you doing about this? Why aren't you giving your half of your work contract? We're giving our half. Yeah, why don't you deliver the way we are? Paying you every month, getting everything you need. Why doesn't it get to that? And it's possibly the only big bee in my small bonnet, for want of a better description.
The thing is, one of the things that we always try to do from the press office, or newly baptized as Department of Communications, is to always work with public perception of just the civil service in general. And we always have this mission of conveying all the very good and efficient and modern and quality work and services that the government provides, which is, I think, undeniable and widely recognized. But there is always this criticism that comes from society.
Very small amounts. Yeah? The majority of people put in a good day's work and put their shoulder behind, and we should be proud of what they do and what they deliver. And I am. It's a very small amount of people who spoil that. And it's also the ethos has to change slightly. And I'm a 60s child. I was born in 65. I was reading something about this the other day where you had to make your own decisions because you didn't have a telephone. You couldn't call a parent and say, what do I do now? So you made your own decisions. So a lot of that is probably part of my DNA, but doesn't form part of younger people's DNA because they everything is done for them. And we fill in their passport forms and we take them on holiday and we pay for this and we do that and the other. So there's not an element of which is possibly every parent's fault at some stage or another. So how do you turn that round? How do you start teaching them what to do as opposed to doing it for them? It's not easy at all. It isn't.
And as you say, I mean, we will, as an entity that employs a substantial part of the population, reflect the values and the lifestyles of modern Gibraltar and the modern world. No? So I think that there are a lot of good things that come from having a softer, more human approach to society,
and it's more dynamic,
and some challenges come with it too.
I'm all for it. I'm all for it, and I see a lot of this, not only in the aviation industry, but also in fire and rescue, where new challenges. New procedures, new equipment, this excellence of change, of let's do things in a different way. Yeah. We now have this bit of kit, how are we going to use that? And that has to filter down. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of use IA and the likes of that now, and I think that's very positive, and it should be nurtured. I have no bones about changing. I've had to change all my life. So why doesn't everybody else? I've probably worked every day, as you do in media. You don't go home at 4, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock on a weekend and forget what's happening in the outside world. You can't. So for me, it's slightly different. And that doesn't mean that people who aren't as good as you. It means that they're just in different roles. It's
the level of seniority you have also comes with those
absolutely, of course, yeah. You wouldn't expect anything less.
So talking about change, I'd love to have a little chat about how, because you've mentioned the Kingsway, you've mentioned the airport, the frontier. What was the frontier, or still is, and not for much longer, is the frontier. A lot of change is happening there. And from a sort of security point of view, it's also going to be much more reflective of the identity of Gibraltarians visually. There's elements that are going to involve the tourism product. Let's talk a little bit about how all of that area...
That's all very positive news, because being an old guy, I remember when the frontier opened, for pedestrians. I think I was there somewhere, standing on somebody's shoulders. And then I remember when it opened for vehicles again. So I remember the social change. We were having this conversation a few weeks ago when we were asking people, do you remember when you used to take out your radio cassette from your car and carry it with you because they got stolen? And then one of the brands brought up that you just used to take off the front bit, so you put it in a jacket instead of carrying that brick everywhere you went with you. All of this is positive change. The way that the frontier works is a bit magical at times, because you have this massive inflow of people that come in every morning and they flood the place. And you don't know where they are, because you're walking around Gibraltar, you see the same faces you see every day. And then in the evening, they all leave. And being one of the persons who worked northernmost in Gib, it's always been painful to see people queuing to get home when they couldn't find jobs in their country and they'd had to come to ours to work here. So there's a lot of very, very good hard workers there that have had no option but to come here to work. They shouldn't be prejudiced, but unfortunately, queues and checks has led them to be. And it's a very human side.
It's the irony of the Spanish political pressure, no? That it's mostly affected Spanish people who come here to work.
But on a daily basis.
Yeah.
On a daily basis. And frontier workers, whatever your nationality you are, because it's no longer just Spanish, are at the receiving end of all of this. Whereas we are home in 10 minutes, and they take an hour and a half. And then they may have to drive somewhere, another hour, another half an hour, wherever it is to get where they're going. So you know that element is it's a very human element, something you have to factor in, something you shouldn't forget. Then there's the identity of the place. Gibraltar has a unique identity. It should never change. I don't think it's ever going to change. Wherever you are in the area around us, you see a different view of the rock. So the rock has always been there when the frontier was closed, and people were saying, "Why can't we get in?" And we were probably saying, we wish we could get out every now and again. So that has always been there. The shape of the rock, the size of the rock, who we are, who we aren't. You go into any average Spanish town and it's whitewashed with tiles on the roofs. You look at us, there's no whitewash. It's more Italian, I think, than anything about it. So that's part of our character, and I think that's what you have to reflect in what you do. I've always said, when you talk about figures, and we used to do about 500,000 passengers a year, that's split 250,000 in, 250,000 out. So half of those, 125,000, used to cross the border and go into Spain. So I always used to say that the 125 that stayed here were coming here for the reason. But the 125 that were crossing the border, we had 2 hours to try and latch them on. Because they would spend about 15, 20 minutes when they landed, pick up their bags and then disappear, whatever it is they were doing, and then about an hour and a half on the way back. So if we could reflect what Gibraltar has always been able to deliver in values, in our formality, in our joy of life and everything that we do, hopefully, next time round, let's stay here or come and visit us. And that hooking effect works to a certain extent, because you get people saying, "Can we leave our luggage? We're going to spend a day in Gib." Well, that's a meal. It's just a meal, but it's a meal. It's a start. And this part of our identity is wherever you go, and people are trying to find out what your accent is. I don't know how many times I've been asked whether I was from the Canary Islands. I don't know why.
Because invariably
they can't pinpoint us. But this is who we are. This is our character, and that's what we need to show.
If you were a tourist and you were coming to Gibraltar, you always have a decent chance that your way out is going to be completely tarnished by this really unpleasant experience of a frontier, of authorities demanding to see your documents, of a potentially long queue in the heat, etc. Like that stuff, nobody's really calculated sort of the reputational impact that kind of thing has on the Gibraltar product. I am willing to bet it has an extremely, extremely high reputational impact, because if you come to Gib and the passage into Gib is problematic, but then you close off your experience at the end of the day when you're tired with another hour and a half at the frontier, like I'm not going back there ever again.
Well, we've seen all sorts of we've had really bad days at the frontier, to be honest, way back in the past. We're talking about in the 90s, when the Rania days and all of that. You had Easters, possibly, when there was an early Easter, and you'd have tourists coming in and children, and they're all in T-shirts and the likes of that. But then 6 o'clock, it's dark and it's cold. And we've been warming bottles in the terminal and doing all sorts of stuff and giving out water, and when it was particularly bad days. And I have really, really bad, well, they went bad in the sense as there's far worse things in the world going on nowadays. But considering that we were all supposed to be a Western European civilized society, there wasn't much civility going on. And that has to change. And the new opportunities now with an open border will make that change, will bring that change. There's an element, I think, missing on the Spanish side of the frontier, which is infrastructure. And if you look at any major hub in the area, they've got trains and Ubers and coaches and major motorways. We are going to be short for, well, not us, but it will affect us. The infrastructure on the other side will have an effect on what comes in and what comes out. Yeah. So to a certain extent, we may be pushing out part of the queues, and it'll be somebody else's problem. But there will be flow, because once you get past a few of the choke points on the other side of the border, it's free flowing.
And it'll be their responsibility also to make a success out of this deal, because again, that's another conversation that's ongoing. The deal will happen, but then we have to make it succeed. We have to make it, the more we make it succeed, the less likely it is that anybody will undermine it. No? And I'm sure there'll be an interest across the way for this. There has to be. Too.
There has to be. I think we've always been in the right place at the right time. I know Gibraltar is very good when it comes to business, and when it comes to formalities in business and business opportunities. We're very small, but we are bigger sometimes in character than what we do, and I'm sure we'll deliver. I'm confident we will. I have no bones about it. The infrastructure has to be there, though. So the works at the terminal and the works in town and all of that will greatly assist in what we need to do. We couldn't have one without the other, put it that way.
Let's talk a little bit about security at the frontier, because I think it's one of the issues that makes some people a little bit unsure. We have a whole new setup. We have a new tri-agency facility coming up. Tell us a little bit about how that's
slightly beyond my remit, because my remit stopped at the terminal, but the terminal itself abuts onto the frontier. So there's an element there for me. I don't have much issues with what's going to happen. The reality is that many of the areas are going to be fenced off anyway, because out of nature, seeing that we had a frontier, some of the areas there were already the boundary wall of whatever we were protecting. Mm-hmm. So whatever comes down will allow people to cross and allow people to get out. But that's always been the case one way or another. Yeah. It's not going to be the first time that something happened in town and people jumped in a rowing boat or a speedboat and got out of Gib. So that it's not that complicated to control. And I think that from the little I know of what I've seen, I think there's enough there for people to be not to be worried about that. The Royal Gibraltar Police will have a major task on hand, because they will be measured by not with what comes in, but how quickly they stop anything going out, possibly, because that's what you want. You want people to be arrested or whatever it is.
You're going to be able to use the choke point if you need it.
If you had to, but that is also part and parcel of our Fortress Gibraltar type of attitude. I don't think people are going to come in here as they would go into other places. And I've seen over the years pickpockets being stopped from coming in and this and the other. That I cannot see stopping, even if you don't have a control there. That they'll be identified somewhere else and they'll be escorted out. I cannot see that. I think it's easy to do, especially in a small place like Gib. You will be able to pick out characters and individuals from a distance.
And we will be using lots of new technology to do that.
The technology that I've seen and heard of is really, really top class. And it creates this fantastic digital barrier, which then just needs to be used, configured, and so that people who have to manage it know how to use it. And that's the same with everything else. I remember when we opened the terminal in 2011 for arrivals, 2012 for departures. We spent a year not knowing what it was going to do, because all of the systems needed configuring. They were configured at the default level. There were so many of them that they would surprise us every 2 or 3 days. you'd have fire alarms going off because a specific valve wasn't working. But there was no danger of fire. It's just that the valve was configured to tell the system, I'm not working, so people are going to die, so evacuate the building.
Trigger an alarm straight away.
That needed configuring, and instead of sounding the alarm, it sent an email or sent a warning. So the configuration aspect will take some time.
Teething issues.
They'll all be there. They will be there.
Let's talk about the airline industry. I know it's not exactly also your remit as such, but obviously as you in the airport, you have an idea and an inclination also. You've gone through a similar experience in the past too. So I wanted to see, I think a lot of people in Gibraltar are excited about the prospect of new destinations, more air travel.
We need to kick off by considering what we had and what we're going to have and what we didn't have. So there's no way we're going to attract any more business if we weren't eligible for internal Schengen flights. The Brexit that kept on giving left us out of everything. So we needed a new air transport services agreement with new regulatory frameworks that we couldn't access and things like that. All of these things are legal vehicles to allow you to be able to fly in. So even if an airline wanted to travel in or fly in here for whatever reason, they couldn't because they couldn't obtain permits, they couldn't fly in, it wasn't permitted. This now lifts all of that. That does not mean we're going to have flights to Paris every day. Remember that aircraft and airlines are going concerns. There's a lot of misconception in that. I hear it every day. The terminal is a bit of, if you want to compare it to the IT world, we're hosts. We are empty. So we have no data. People come in, use us, and leave. What you do when you buy a ticket, which is a contract between you and the airline, is between you and the airline. The terminal has got nothing to do with that. We just supply the building for the airline to do it. That also reflects on whatever business comes away. I know that Minister Santos is actively trying to attract more business, and I'm sure that they will come at some stage or another. But airlines will only come here, they're going to make a profit. The airlines will not fly here for the worst intentions of the world. They're here because they want to make money, full stop. If you look at the catchment area around Gibraltar, and you draw a circle roughly 100 kilometers or an hour away, 2/3 of it is the sea in another country, which is Morocco, and the other bit is very rural. So population densities aren't that high. That doesn't mean that we won't have the traffic. It just means that you have to factor that in. So people need to travel further. They do anyway. I mean, if you fly into a major UK airport like Gatwick, which is in the middle of the countryside, people traveling there are not from Gatwick. They're from everywhere in that corner of the United Kingdom. But you need the infrastructure to get them there. So that will develop slowly, and I'm confident we will. The other aspect of it is that we've always looked at the promotion of the destination rather than the airport. That could change, because if the airport becomes the gateway, you will have the possibility of airlines wishing to fly into Gib because they want to bring people to this area. So it's not linked directly to the tourism, stay in a hotel and the normal leisure activities. It's the workhorses, like the constant, I mean, you see it in any other, the Malaga-Madrid flights, Malaga-Barcelona flights. A lot of that isn't tourism. It's day-to-day people coming to work. It's people going for meetings, it's business, it's technicians that are coming to fix your washing machine, it's people going to a conference, all of that. When Cordoba was signed, we had Iberia flying in. Technically, wrong aircraft at the wrong time of day, because they were coming in around lunchtime with a big Airbus. If they'd come in earlier in the morning with a smaller commuter flight, which there's a bigger chance for you to make some money on it, they probably have gone a bit longer. The British Airways used to do the afternoon or the evening one. It's too big of an aircraft. The short distances are in direct competition with the high-speed train. Not in Spain, everywhere. It even gets stretches out to funding and the likes of that. So if you have a high-speed train option, your chances are you're not going to get any assistance for funding for an air route. The other advantage of high-speed trains is that they take you to the center of the city that you're traveling to, whereas the airport is normally an hour away, an hour and a half away. So it advantages and disadvantages. So if you start looking a bit further,
maybe the northern part of Spain, Gibraltar, wanted to try and come in. Bilbao, Barcelona is a hub in itself. There could be opportunity for some of them. I honestly am not directly involved. My role is a technical one. We welcome all of that and see where it takes us. But it's important that we understand that if we did not have the facility that we have now created, or the political agreement which allows us to travel through the Schengen zone, this wouldn't have happened. And sooner or later, it's happening now. I don't know if you've watched the news the last couple of days. United Kingdom is having all sorts of issues with their travellers having to queue up for the EES system, and there's horror stories of people being left behind in Italy and all sorts of... That would have been our cup of tea. We'd have faced that. So our 50% traffic that used to cross the border wouldn't have come. And before you know it, you get flights being consolidated, and instead of having daily services, you have 3 a week. And it becomes a decline. And it's a natural progression of we're here to make money and we're not. So, sorry, we're going somewhere else.
But everything you describe, like for example, in this part of Campo de Gibraltar in particular, no trains, hardly any trains, very little of that kind of infrastructure. The other airports close by, we have Jerez, which is quite a small airport.
Yeah, not really. Jerez is Sevilla's smaller cousin, and Sevilla will never allow Jerez to become bigger. And Sevilla and Malaga are at each other's throats on a daily basis, and that's public.
Competition?
Incredible. They are Malaga. I was reading an article yesterday. I think they did 5 million passengers in the first quarter this year. 2 million of that was during Holy Week only. So it's become the number 3 in Spain. Mm-hmm. When you have American Airlines trying to fly across the pond and are choosing a Spanish destination, the rife between the mayor of Seville and the mayor of Malaga has been ridiculous, and you can look it up. It's all there. And accusing each other of all sorts of stuff because Malaga was getting daily flights and Sevilla lost them. So that little area, even though Sevilla is the capital of Andalusia, Jerez will never get bigger than it is now. And we have an opportunity to fill up the gaps.
Exactly.
And we always did well because we were near the areas where people flew in for timeshares. The larger hotels and resort hotels went that around. You have to go up Costa de la Luz, Chiclana, that areas where they're there now. Mm-hmm. But in the past, there wasn't much. Yeah. So we had a lot more traffic, people coming in to stay in villas and parents' houses and friends' houses than Malaga, which is centered with all the complete hotel industry and the likes of that. And they've upped their game too, and considerably. And you look at any of the Spanish cities now, they're not what they used to be 10 years ago. They've upped their product quite a lot. You can see that they've dropped in levels of crime, which has attracted more people in. They're upgrading a lot of their things like trams and subways and the likes of that, and they know that they're in their competition with other areas of Europe. So this is where we need to feed off from, and I think we will. I'm confident that we will.
And the best case scenario, if we are extremely successful at attracting business and tourists and visitors and commuters and all of this, how would the Gibraltar airport working at sort of full steam look like?
The Sunday mornings is the best example of that at the moment. When we received the information on the summer flight schedule and we saw that Sunday mornings we were having 5 flights in the same hour, we went back and he said, can you give us at least 20 minutes between them? Stretch it out a bit. Only because we want to be able to deliver a proper service to your passengers. We have 2 airlines. One of the airlines had 4 of their flights within that hour. Don't expect us to be able to give you the service we want to with the resource that we have in an hour, when if you gave us another half an hour, we could probably do a much better job of it. Mm-hmm. And they couldn't change because they have slot control at source and all sorts of trouble, so it stayed as it was. We are now processing roughly between 1,000, just under 1,000 people in both directions in an hour. If we can do that on Sunday mornings, we can do that all day. It's just larger volume. Mm-hmm. The issues we have is parking. I have 5 stands I can use. If I have the 5 stands full all day with scheduled services, it means that my non-scheduled services can't come in. Today, we had a large non-scheduled service to Lourdes, which the bishop, I think, had organized, and we've had some people leaving on that flight. Other scheduled services are all the private aircraft that come in and out, part of the business jet community. There's another slight misconception there. When we talk about scheduled services, they are technically buses. They come in, they load up, they go. It's as simple as that. But non-scheduled services are as diverse as all the road traffic you have out there. You've got Ubers, taxis, scooters, bicycles, motorcycles. Imagine them as non-scheduled services. If you have no room, you can't take them in. If you can't have them in, you're curtailing it. So you have to have an intelligent way of doing this. If we stop a private aircraft from landing with one passenger, because we need that stand for a scheduled service, which is the right way to do it, we could also be jeopardizing that passenger who's coming to invest in Gibraltar. So that doesn't mean we cancel one or the other. That means we try and work it out so they both come in. But this is where it starts getting quite in the weeds and try and sort things out. Can you come in half an hour later? Could you try and leave by such and such a time? And
which those non-scheduled flights can do quite easily, I imagine. No?
Yeah, they can, yeah. There are sometimes issues because if they come from too far, the crew times are the same, the crew hours are the same. So if they're flying across the Atlantic, they need to land here by such and such a time because if not, the crew can't fly anymore. But that is something that you work with them. But that's the biggest one for me at the moment. It's my lack of space. I'm trying to do something about that, and so you see where we can take that. But that will come. But if you can imagine, I don't think anybody in Gibraltar would like flights operating here all night. Well, they couldn't at the moment anyway, because the airport is run by the Ministry of Defence. It opens at, I think it's 8:45 in the morning and finishes at 10 o'clock at night. But there's a lot of scope within that, within 5 stands and aircraft coming in, a combination of larger aircraft, commuter traffic, business jets, to keep us busy. Of course there is. I mean, it's there. Just needs to manage it and handle it. I don't see a problem.
Of course, I imagine we'll have to find the right kind of balance, no, between getting the kind of transport that we want, the kind of client, if you like, that we're interested in,
Absolutely, yeah.
and the right kind of level of transport and movement in our airport that allows space for these non-scheduled flights. We'll find a new kind of balance.
Of course we will. And there's a lot of the unknown at the moment because we still haven't experienced what the EAS how it will work within the terminal. The terminal was built for the Cordoba Agreement. The Cordoba Agreement took everybody to the frontier, put them into an annex, and then brought them back. That changes slightly now because we bring Schengen into the building. So we've done as best we could with very, very little notice, measured in hours, in single numbers, to try and have plans ready, which we could action the following day and get the contractors working on them, future-proofing them, and at the same time staying operational and staying compliant with aviation security, not breaking any rules, and doing things properly. So it's been a massive challenge and a lot of work, but it's there. Now it just needs to be tested. And we'll see where it goes. And it may have to be tweaked at some stage or another, and I'm sure it will. But the beauty of a lot of it is what I mentioned before. It's like a production, like a show. So it'll land, it'll come off, they'll all go. And then we'll have another lot, and another lot, and another lot, and that's it. There's no long days unless there's diversions and disruptions, which are terrible, and I suffer every time that happens. It's not something which stays on. You have an 8-hour issue. You have a 45-minute window. It's like a very slow F1 pit stop. Mm-hmm. The airlines speak to the handling agents, and they will tell them, this is what we want you to do. Aircraft land, chocks on. Minute 3, people start disembarking. Minute 8, people start cleaning at the back. Minute 12, it's literally like that. Yeah. It's literally a very slow F1 pit stop. By minute so-and-so, you need to have your pre-boarding done. By minute so-and-so, you need to be loading the front and the rear holds. And that's what the time that you have.
And every minute you waste is money lost for everybody,
money
problems
lost,
for the
and
schedules,
sometimes penalties.
coming late.
Sometimes the airline will penalize the handling agents. Also, that has to be factored in too. That's not as simple as that. For some, if you have delays which are due to security or the likes of that, you can get away with it. But if they're due to equipment or the likes of that, the airlines are also no fools. They know who they're dealing with. They have handling agents in every part of the world. So they know how to use them, manage them, and they know how to assist them and support them. So they will come in and check all our equipment. Remember, all the equipment there now belongs to the government of Gibraltar. It's ours. In fact, we've just received this week our third AVI ramp, which have become really, really popular. So we bought 2 of them a couple of years ago, and the third one arrived today, just in time to be used for the summer season. So I'm happy to be able to announce that that should be online sooner rather than later. And if you're not familiar with the AVI ramps, they're the big ramps that we normally use. The world of passengers with reduced mobility has changed incredibly, and this is not knocking at that either. But there was a time when it was people who were incapacitated because they either couldn't walk or needed assistance because they couldn't carry. But with the new hidden disabilities, there are a lot of people that needed help that weren't asking for it, and now they do. So the passenger assistance has shot up across the whole of the industry. Sometimes little things like the AVI ramp, which is a very slow and gradual ramp going up with it's got a double banister, will get rid of the problem for you because the person doesn't need carrying. The person can manage on their own. They're traveling with children, all of that. So you remove that element of it. So it's really good. It's very positive. Hoping to see it in action soon.
So on that note, thank you so much for coming to the podcast. Thank you for giving us all the reassurance that we need and for operating the airport so efficiently. I wish you many good runs of your daily show, and I'll see you, I guess, at the next treaty implementation meeting with no longer
in a couple of days' time.
The Damocles sword of a deadline round the corner.
I have to take the opportunity also to thanking you and your department, because you are my voice piece. You get me out of all sorts of trouble. And it's very interesting because I don't have my own media people. I rely on you and your staff, and I've never had a bad thing to say about any of you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Terence. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Carl, welcome to Not Another Press Release. This is a podcast designed to sort of showcase the work of the government, the civil service, the public sector. We've invited you because you are a guy who gets stuff done, who has a very strong kind of proactive, can-do kind of mentality, which I think is very, very powerful, very useful. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself, because I'm sure most people know who you are, but tell me a little bit about your background, where you come from, who you are, what makes you tick, what you like.
Okay. It's the second time I've had that question, and I had a few kids from the Spanish school group coming over and asking me just that. The way it was phrased to me, pero tú que eres llanito puro. So I'm not really sure what that then means, but I would say yes, I'm grown and bred here. Proudly did my first my degree in Plymouth University in architecture. If I had to talk about my previous years, I've been inspired by many of our teachers here, and I usually mention what is Eddie Gonzalez as a history teacher. And the one thing that he would tell me is not what we know, but what we don't know. And that line of questioning, and never accept what you see firsthand, look for bias. So, and that has lived on with me.
Were you interested in architecture from the start?
No.
What drew you to that field?
I would like to, I think because I was perhaps a very confused young man. So I love the arts. It's always comes naturally to me. I've always been creative. Call me a nerd, but even back then, my younger years, sketching out anything from fantasy dungeons and medieval villages. But I also love the sciences. I love the structured way of handling things. So, not knowing what I was going to go into really until my into my A levels, I chose the 3 sciences. So yes, I went into this chemistry, biology, and physics. Went down that route, but I don't regret it. However, I missed the creative, the artistic side, and that's when probably when I was filling in my UCAS forms instead of going into medicine. I decided, which was like the normal thing you do with those subjects, I decided to go into architecture because it seems to be a very structured kind of profession, but then you can be as creative as you can be. And I don't regret that, but it was a huge jump from going to knowing about cell division to joining what is an academy or a school of architecture where I didn't know about construction and I didn't have the background of construction. So that was a very quick learning curve for me. So I did my years in Plymouth, and then I came back to Gibraltar to do what was my year out. You do your year out to go back and then do what is a postgraduate. And it was in that year that there was a recession in Gibraltar, but I really wanted to learn from those in authority, those who were the drivers of construction. And at that time during a recession, imagine, it was not difficult, it was very difficult, but luckily I worked for a team, Procon, who were project managers, and they had driven what were their big reclamation schemes with Volker Steven. They had access to AutoCAD and programs that nobody else did. So I wasn't paid. It was a whole year of training that I went through. But those years, I would not give them up. I met fantastic people, the best in the profession, from engineers to architects, project managers, how they would deal with contractors also would be a lesson to be learned. And I was lucky in that we had pushed forward was changes in Gibraltar, and there's a young student. One of the things that always surprised me is that we must have been probably the only European city that didn't have a pedestrianised main street. So these are like the simple things, you know, how come? And
Low-hanging fruit, they call them, no?
I would say exactly. And then I started to realize the politics of any projects. How do you convince every single trader that their cars will not be able to go through what is Main Street? How do you convince politicians, those in the construction? How do you get all utility providers to talk to each other? And when you do a trench, you have everybody compliant doing that, which is, even today is almost unheard. So that was my first project at the age of 21. I didn't go into it was to do my part 2, but I reckon the school the schooling that I received during that time is well, even to date we haven't gone through that. So I was very lucky to be able to drive that project. And then one thing led to another. Being in the private sector, working for Procon, one of our main clients was the Montague Group, and we were able to deliver what were some of the largest estates. So that was a very also an area that I was able to move into project management and clerk, and being also a clerk of works on site and seeing how things work. And that's where you really learn what architecture is all about. You can design something which is perfectly, it looks beautiful. How do you get it built? And how do you get it built for a price? And how do you, are there supplies and the materials nearby? This is the legislation that now we have. So trying to make something look old, which is sometimes a conversation that we have. Yes, you can try and do that, but the regulations that exist today will make much of this very, very difficult to achieve or very costly. So that was, and for 5 years I was working for Procon. Then I changed. I worked for Haida, who had the Ministry of Defence, their contracts. I saw a different world there. And after that, there was a vacancy for a conservation officer, and that was in 1999. So I joined the public service in the year 2000, and that was like a whole new sort of environment, from going in the private sector in a very aggressive environment where you put in a lot of hours, to then joining a much larger and sometimes a bureaucratic sort of system. So that was a
Give me one sec.
Yeah. So that I had to adapt to, and again I started working with in the town planning department with Robert Santos, Paul Origo, and down there, Keith Asopardi at the time was the minister. And this was a new post, that of a conservation officer, and I don't think anybody really knew what it was. And I recall, I think it was with the minister then, saying, look, we want some advice on what kind of timber shutters we should have, and what kind of lime mortar. And yes, the technical stuff is easy, but I recall telling him, well, Gibraltar is it's a fortress of fortresses, but yet you cannot see them. We've got a power station right in front of the King's Bastion, a medieval castle that only those that serve a prison sentence can enjoy it, and buildings.
Enjoy it.
Being different, I think.
Yeah.
So, and I remember saying that what we need is a strategy, is a vision to expose this magnificent fortress. And I remember him just, lying back and going like, okay, do it. So in many ways, I felt that my wings were unclipped, And I came up with some crazy ideas, which was identifying every single leaseholder on the walls, finding out how long do they have on the lease, are there proposals to, or can we consider knocking some of these buildings down? And I remember opposite Montague Gardens, what I used to call the Linares building, that was the first one that came down. Near Chatham, Counterguard, there was also buildings that also came down. The power station, that was, and in like 3 years, all of a sudden we identified key locations which we could clear to start expose our walls. The prison, the relocation of our prison to what was Lapri. So all of that happened in just under a year. So
What year was that?
I think that must have been between 2000 and 2004, more or less. I think that was that particular period where it was like investigating what assets do we have, let's put together a vision. And then, even in the first 6 months, the Hayes level area, the tunnels, I remember also that was, and previously by the MOD had released it, so I was able to quickly move into that project, clear it up, and I recall Richard de Soysa, I think, was the first one that took that as a project. So we spent also quite a few weeks and pushing that. And so that was my first few years. Then I was kidnapped into number 6 to drive really what was an urban regeneration project, where Calle Comedia was the first one. And this was the result of a few sketches that I would produce in the early hours of the morning when I'd feel inspired, and I would go, why does Rome have the Spanish Steps, and here we could have something which is just as beautiful, but it's just uncared for. So these sketches found their way to the office of the chief minister at the time, and I was called into number 6 to drive what was a vision of urban regeneration. And that was a new phase also for me. So it was the Calle Comedia, Galpe Barracks, a flat bastion mews, also a few properties around Castle Street. Chatham Counterguard was another quick sketch which I put together. And these things, in fact, I recently was doing some clearing up, and I saw the first, an agenda, and I could see all these projects lined up, so Viagas to do. And I crumpled it up, about to throw it away. And I then picked up what was a press release of Calle Comedia completed, Galpe Barracks done, the flat bastions went out for new purchasers.
Check.
And I looked at the dates, it was just over a year. So within a year, we had all these projects just lined up. And it's quite gratifying to be able to see that original sketch, that meeting where you can see the only one with action points was me, and then having delivered that. So it is really gratifying to see a community enjoy a vision which I've presented to my political masters.
I think I wanted to get in there a little bit later in the interview, but you've opened up the conversation already. So in any big organization, and if you're in any kind of management position, and I think this would be an interesting thing for anybody, any of our colleagues within the civil service who have to manage big teams, that have to liaise with stakeholders, that have to somehow work with a lot of different moving parts. And it's, from my own perspective, with a small team, but who sometimes work with other bigger teams, and who sometimes have to face situations when there are many moving parts, many different agendas, a lot of complications. We've had many conversations about this. What is your take? What is your what insight can you give as to how you manage these moving parts, these sometimes conflicting agendas, and get them all to work in one direction for the greater good?
There's no golden bullet here. There's no one quick fix to all of them. I think the key is your own ability to adapt. I think the most successful species are not the strongest, are the ones that can evolve quicker. And I think that's what you probably have to do. You are right, it is not easy, and I've found it not only with the civil servants and officers, but also with politicians. They will vary. You have not only across administrations, but within an administration, portfolios are changed. So sometimes the vision that a previous minister had, it's not the same. So you're right, they are all moving elements. Okay, so it's not an easy question to answer. So how would I... first of all, the client expectation. I think that's what you need to identify. What does the client want? So it's two things there. Who is the client? Mm-hmm. And when they say government, no, para. I need a name on that agenda. I need that person that can drive, who has got that vision, that commitment. That's to be clear. So then hopefully it's that one vision that you need to be clear of what's required if we're talking of senior management. And sometimes I get accused of being aggressive, and that's probably an accurate statement, because I need to get an accurate statement from the minister in most cases as a client. So what is it that you want, and have that constant dialogue with them. How to transmit that onto what is a project, and I'll focus my angle on projects. It is not easy. I think probably I've got an advantage being an architect. I've been, in fact, a useful example. I remember having this conversation with a previous minister for justice with the law courts. That was one where I remember having this same conversation, and I didn't agree with what was his original vision of adding an extra floor to the police station. And I said, look, no, the Gibraltar is failing in terms of the administration of justice, because we have all these ad hoc buildings, all these tumors that have been added to buildings trying to satisfy a pressing need, and that's not how you do it. You need to take a step back and see what are the needs. And here we had a backlog of years, family court and others, so it was literally on the back of a napkin that I sketched out what we needed to do to the law courts, not only creating the extra space below, but adding an extra floor. And again, he was very conscious that it was a listed monument, then adding the whole building at the back so that we could consolidate civil servant offices. That sketch, I think, still hangs on his library. But it's conveying that message clearly to be sure that's what they want, and then hopefully transmitting it to all these other departments.
There has to be a balance between sort of a collegiate approach, allowing other people into the discussion, and some kind of direction and authority, no? Because that's, I find, very, very, very challenging.
You need to. And I've got to accept that I will be criticized for it. There's different ways, and I work with every minister on this. And you can see that amongst them, that their styles differ. I've got my own, and I'm sure that many that don't like it. But then again, I've also have a track record, so I think I can at least show what I've been able to produce. And I think that this, first of all, it's treating everybody fairly. I think that's we start off with that, and I think that this is also is transmitted to our children. But don't let them take the mickey. I think that really should be the angle. So with these projects, transmitting that clear idea onto departments, and also what I would first of all recommend is that as a project manager, I am responsible. I am to blame. If anything goes wrong, I'm happy to take the hit, and then I'll take it up with perhaps those that failed. But when the project is a success, it's your political masters that then they have been the sponsors for it, so they deserve that recognition because they have placed their trust on one. How do you deal with these departments? It's not easy. There are histories, there's egos, there's agendas, and I think before being a technical officer, you've got to be a psychologist first. You've got to understand what drives every person. You've got to identify who's who in a team. You've got your alpha male there that will want the attention. You know who they are. You've got to keep them away from other alphas. Then you've got others who are just happy to do things how it's always been done, and they will not want to change. Sometimes I find that frustrating, but they are key. These are the little ants that will keep on working, and they will not let you down. And you just need to direct them. So there is a role for them. Then you have other officers que it's unfair to say que mejor no pegan un palo, and we see. But sometimes these are key. They maintain the morale. Sometimes you can see that they're the funny guys, the ones that if I bash perhaps somebody because of being incompetent, that's the person that put the arm around them, and they say, no le haga caso, I think they'll go for a drink. So it's how you place these people within teams that makes the entire whole work better as an organism. It's not easy, and this changes. And sometimes once you create these teams, which takes years, it's terribly frustrating when they are moved to a different location, or they get a promotion somewhere from being a technical to a different department. That has a huge detrimental effect to the rest of it, and I think very few people know that. So I've encountered that numerous times, and filling in and changing the effect it has on a program and the morale on the rest is significant. So you've got to be watchful of the human factor. The technical part on projects, that's the easy bit. That we will always overcome.
What about the bureaucracy, the red tape, the layers of approvals that sometimes happen, the sort of the decision-making process that becomes diluted between different heads and different ministers? Because again, something that I encounter on a daily basis, and sometimes makes things much more sclerotic and problematic.
I've got a reputation for doing the Viagas, hace lo que da la gana. I don't think that's true, but you're absolutely right. Sometimes we've introduced systems without really knowing why, and sometimes these systems go back a century. Siempre se ha hecho así. My first angle is be very familiar with the legislation. What does the legislation state? Because in many cases, that legislation has not been updated with systems. And having been fully conscious of what the legislation states, who needs to be informed. So if there's a minister or head of departments, I will follow that to the letter. That there are systems where you need to involve 400 people. These are systems which in many cases I do not agree with. So in many of my projects, a bank, the Gibraltar bank, had to be delivered in a year. Now the legislation is very clear that I needed my planning permission, I needed building control approval, energy performance of the buildings have to be complied with. Once I've got those permits, I know my regulations. I will make sure that my buildings will be compliant. If the relevant officer was to come over to check it, I'm more than happy. If he points out that there's a breach, I will take that. But going through a system for that approval when perhaps it's not legally, it's a risk that I will take. So that bank, knowing what was at stake, 300 mortgages, that the Barclays was leaving, the political pressure, timelines, nesting birds, you cannot go through systems which have been in place that perhaps help with other projects. One has to be conscious of what is at stake here.
Yeah.
And in my case, and some will say Carl just rolls roughshod over all this bureaucracy. Yes, maybe I do. And I'm happy to be then judged on my performance. But I can say that legislation was not breached and the project was delivered. The systems, the bureaucratic systems, but perhaps, if not ignored, well.
So when in doubt, just do it. Make it happen.
Make sure that the legislation, I think, is always what's important. And sometimes it needs to be reviewed. In fact, I've been also responsible for changing some elements of legislation which just not make sense. One example is salt water tanks on top of buildings. Now, that's crazy. So I understand that 100 years ago, if there was a very common salt and salt water and fresh water was very difficult to get to, well, yes, you've got a tank that would be able to supply a small building. But when you multiply that to a building which is 7 stories high, you place this fiberglass tank which is over a ton, multiply that by 8, you've got a bomb up there. You virtually are waiting for a matter of time before these things will break, and you've got salt water going through entire flats. So seeing that legislation, challenging it and saying, okay, we virtually have some quick measures, but we've been able to overcome that. Even the weight alone of those tanks on top of these buildings. So that was removed. And again, I received flack from those very senior officers who have always been doing things a certain way. But when you push and you ask the questions, well, why do we keep on doing this? Hopefully it's people like me, that in some cases we will make mistakes, that will drive that change. And I think there are those now who are grateful that they don't have like 10 tons of salt water on top of their heads.
And you say that sometimes we make mistakes, and I find that the mistakes are always very educational. You know, they help us to learn a lot about how we work and how things work. Have you identified any mistakes that you've made that have taught you a lot about how to get things done?
I've always seen life as not something that we regret. I don't think everything is not a mistake, perhaps it's an experience. I'm sure I've made countless of mistakes. Those people that take decisions will. And the easiest thing is not to take a decision. But I can't think of one or a regret that I have. Now, in every single case, when it comes to at least to my projects or even life lessons, there's always something that you learn from. We become better people by recognizing that it was perhaps an error, and how do you grow from that.
And maybe a project that you sort of went into with a very clear idea, and halfway through you realized that this approach wasn't going to work, and that you had to find a different way to.
Okay. See, there have been of those. Adapting to a project is something that, and it's very quick decisions. You can't go to anybody else.
It must happen in most projects, no?
Okay. I'd like to say no, in the sense that very few people realize that the design and period of a project takes as long, sometimes more, than the actual construction. So you try and predict all those issues that you're saying at that stage and have possibilities, so that it's easier to make mistakes on paper than to do it on site. However, where I think you are correct, is that many times we don't appreciate that. Or our clients don't appreciate, they want to start working, when can I start? They want to see the first brick being laid.
Yeah.
If you haven't done that, those are the expensive mistakes. And trying to design on the go, that's hugely expensive because there's decisions that you need to take and you are perhaps not aware of how that will impact what is the cable runs or other trenches. There's all these knock-on effects, especially with complex buildings. When it comes to historical buildings, even more so.
Exactly, because I was going to comment on I did a visit with you to the Northern Defences,
Yeah.
and you just told me about how you were uncovering things
Yeah,
and discovering
yeah, yeah.
things on the go.
Yeah.
Huh?
So in that case, and the way I've been able to deal with it is by having multiple teams. So you're very flexible on how you can move them. In fact, the recent storms that we had, all of a sudden, we find ourselves that we've got like 2 weeks of no activity. Now, there's a price to pay for all those guys that are going to be sitting around. So how do you adapt to that? And that's sometimes where I get the most stressed, having to move all these teams when there are unforeseen circumstances. In this case, I moved them to Landport Tunnel, which was not strictly speaking part of the Northern Defences, but it's a site which I have seen in multiple promises and manifestos that we're going to fix the Landport. And you must agree, this is the shop front to Gibraltar.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, it's not something that we can be proud of. So I tested what was a section to see if in fact it would be the historical brickwork that we have. And instead of finding what is the British construction, which is what the label, or the sign that we have there, saying 1727, I think it dates back to at least 2 different periods, or even from the same sort of Spanish. I reckon it's at least Spanish, but there could be some maybe Arabic elements there. But that was a way of reacting towards a situation that was beyond us, so they're moving the guys down there. And I think that I'll send you some photographs of what we have. We've now been able to hack off what is, or remove all the plaster, the Portland cement, to expose what is the true shop front to Gibraltar, where you're walking into what is a medieval castle. That already sets what is a different sense to those who are coming to Gibraltar. You get to see that you're being immersed in history. And I think that's what this new intervention, and this reaction to a problem has enabled us to do.
There's always this issue when it comes to heritage and when it comes to sort of projecting a brand, in Gibraltar, and we've also discussed this many times before, where there's always been this drive to project an image that is this kind of uniform British identity. Yeah? But Gibraltar has far more history and far more complexity than that. And you find it in your work in a day-to-day. And you always come to an open mind, with an open mind, to try and understand the truth and to, get as much value out of all the heritage, regardless of where it comes from. What has been your experience of dealing with that political side?
Well, I've never seen it political. That's the work for politicians, really. I've seen it as, you said, the truth. But I think it enriches us, and I think that all our politicians have been able to capture that. In fact, sometimes it's the public that sometimes that have the problem. In fact, recently, what was it? It created all sorts of controversy. What was La Puerta de España? That came out, and some people were complaining. To tell you the truth, first of all, it was documented, and for me personally, I'm not offended, because if there's a door that says that España is to the north, and guess what? To the south is not España. So that was perhaps one example, but I understand, because sometimes it creates pressure, and our political masters will need to react to it. In my case, I'm fascinated about history and the story to be told, but I do reckon that it's been very biased towards the British side. We seem to jump from what is Neanderthals all the way to Elliot. Entre medio no ha habido nada. No, come on, I think we need, and even today I've just been past what is a post from The Guardian highlighting the numerous Roman wrecks in the bay. It just shows that this was a very rich area, way before the British, the Spanish, and the Moors. We are talking of what is part of a Roman Empire, and these straits were the equivalent of the Straits of Hormuz. Basically, all the riches that were coming from the Atlantic had to be controlled through this choke point. We had ivory and gold from the Ivory Coast, tin from Britannia. We have also silver from Spain, and the oils. They would have to be controlled through this area. And Cartagena, where the refineries, that was the first Roman colony. It was Punic before then. So you're talking about the largest maritime nation, and then the Romans that had this settlement in Cartagena. Algeciras being the main fisheries area. So when you look at this big lump of rock here, and that controls the movement across the straits, it's difficult for me to accept that, the Romans that would be able to, they built a ramp all the way up to Masada, that saw this big lump of rock and said, you know what, nah, we're not going to place a lookout here or a beacon or a shipbuilding area. So right now, I think that our history will stretch beyond what we have normally put into a narrative. Now, the northern defences, I feel, is key to understanding this narrative.
I was going to go there because the concept that you've presented to me of what you're doing in the northern defences, I think, tells that story. No, is it the three empires?
Correct. So I think right now we'll go, instead of just, I think Gibraltar can tell a fantastic story. So on that one, I propose what was and it's one that Fortress Attractions have held on to, is the story of three empires. So the British one will be told, in fact, hopefully in June. That Tim, I'm plugging your book here. Tim Wilburn has produced a book on the British side of the northern defences. It's a fantastic gazette of what we have there. Hopefully next year we'll have a next one to the series, which will be the Spanish ones. And I've just been able to collect manuscripts. I've bought, in fact, I've paid for myself personally some manuscripts from different libraries and universities, and that tell stories of what is the Spanish period. And that is amazing. Also, what is the Italian engineers that were used for the top guys. In fact, it was recently, I was in Ibiza, Majorca, and they celebrate what is their engineers and architects, who was also the same one that fortified Gibraltar. So we've got here what is the Italian Renaissance architecture, and it's written in detail. So that story, I think, has to be told, which is what the British built up upon, and they were able to defeat. So those defences at that Renaissance, the 1600s period, are incredible. And then obviously we've got the Moors, who left here what was a fortification that allowed for the conquest of Al-Andalus, so which is one of the richest histories of Spain. They advanced all the way past the Pyrenees. How they did that to be able to maintain logistical and commercial lines between different states. Gibraltar was key to that movement. So sometimes we kind of disregard that. And I think these are periods of history which are enriching. So I think that myself, yourselves, that history needs to be told. I wouldn't like to go yet into previous ones, like I mentioned with other civilizations and empires, but I think it's just quite reasonable to expect finds. But right now we still need to study it in more detail.
I also enjoy our conversations when you tell me how you sort of joust with the academic establishment and how your unorthodox style does degrade some people in the academic world a little bit.
Well, we've seen it in the press, but I think it's fantastic. I think this is what academia should be about, of involving everyone. And I know that sometimes we feel protective about defending a narrative which has existed for decades. I get that. But sometimes it needs somebody out there to perhaps question, push. And at the end of the day, I think that sharing knowledge is better, enriches all of us. With the academics, what I've always sometimes found, and perhaps it's not fair for me to say that or many see them as an elite, that the information stays within a few, it's not shared, and any dissenting voices is met and crushed. 100 years ago, people would have been burnt at the stake for making such claims against established orthodoxy. I think that all these things need to be challenged, and I'm happy to be there to have these conversations. But also, what's very useful is that I think not just me, others who perhaps are not in the academic crowds, because at the end of the day, many of the academics will be reading records that have been published by other sources with a bias. So you've got to, and there's always interpretation. But architects, engineers, military experts, those of us that are familiar with different elements can provide a little bit of useful information that perhaps it's not the answer, but perhaps can shift the narrative in a different direction, or at least maybe, if not create doubt, there could be somebody out there, like very recently, I put it out there too, with the recent finds in the Landport Gate of these glass bottles. Now, if you ask me whether would I go to an academic or by putting it on the area, the amount of locals that used to work in the area, they didn't want to be named. I can't actually. And those were acid bottles. We used them to descale it, but we didn't want to get rid of them, so we just shoved them in there and sealed it up. That has value too. Of course. And I think it's a question of mixing. But what I believe is always very useful is to encourage debate within the community, because it's only now that we're having now different conversations, even here, about these elements that before would only find their way in what are conferences and very select areas. So I think it's always useful to have this dialogue.
Excellent. So let's finish by looking at some of the other projects that you have ongoing. No?
Okay.
Work ongoing in the Parliament, the refurbishment there.
Okay, let's list those out. So very recently, I was able to work with one of our friends at the CSRO, Carl Triay, who's excellent. We go back to the days of here at number 6. So I was able to quickly, in 3 months, we were able to convert what was the second floor of the Allianz Place into the new CSRO offices. And I think it was the staff really needed that. You know, fantastic guys. I've worked with many of them. To have been working under the conditions of the old building is something that you've got to admire them. So again, I get my satisfaction of being able to provide with them with a better facility, and that then echoes in what is their behaviour, their approach of waking up in the morning, being able to go to a place where there's no cockroaches going over your feet, you know, so at that level. So that is what usually I get my thrills about. So that project was done and dusted. I'm currently working on what is the mount where Dr. Joseph Garcia he's always great. He's a gentleman. He puts up with me. So on that one, it's been passed on to the Ministry for Culture to be able to arrange what are events, because it is a fantastic venue. I will continue with what is the main residence, and government has put it out now for expressions of interest, but the focus is now to develop that building into potentially a boutique hotel. We need to look into the details of that one. And I've also, again, talking about people in the civil service, I have got, I believe, Lorenzo and Jonathan, who are great. They don't complain. They always entertain me at whatever times. They'll call me up when there's a leak. So you've got to praise these guys for being there, putting countless hours that are not normally recognized by the private sector or others. They sit around. I give no, guys, this is somebody who breaks his back, you know, in keeping that area cleared. So then we go on to the Parliament. That one is a very difficult project, apart from the heritage side of it. It's because it's in function. This is like you wanted to have a new kitchen built, but still insist that you need to serve, you know, meals every 3 times a day. How do you do that? We can make it work, but it is complex. So I've got to deal with what is, on one side, the members of government, the MPs on the opposition, but most fearful of all, I've got Madam Speaker that I've got to keep happy. So it's a complex project, being able to move and shuffle loads of teams on different areas. The inconvenience is incredible to staff there. But now in this recess, what we currently have been able to do and prepared, so much of the heavy lifting has been done and demolitions. The lift pit has been completed. The staircase, the public staircase, has been demolished. We're going to be able to fit what is a staircase and lift there, but access to the lift will have to go through the ground floor. So all of that is currently happening today. So we're seeing that in the next 5 weeks or so, we should be seeing significant improvements to the whole of the Parliament building. So that's that one. And then we can move on to the land port, which I've briefly mentioned, which is more of a facelift to the whole area, but we have found this chamber, and I wouldn't be surprised that we have another chamber on the opposite side. It would make sense to put it this way. Grand Battery is about 20 meters thick. It makes little sense when a cannonball can be stopped by the first 3 meters for the rest of it to be solid. So I wouldn't be surprised we've got casemates or these, you know, these arched areas like inside those areas. So let's see. We could be pleasantly surprised. And then the northern defences, that one is government when it awarded an expressions of interest to Fortress Attractions. I'm virtually there every single day trying to make sure that I am the contract administrator. So my role is to make sure that they are delivering to the government's expectations. So government doesn't lose control of the site. So who gets employed, the hours that they put in, and whether there's archaeology on site. I volunteer to also do tours once a month in the area. So, and then it's reacting to elements that we find. And I think I'm in the best position to be able to quickly take a decision on any element and for that to progress. And hopefully the northern defences, towards the end of the year, we should be seeing what is a huge product to our tourists, what we can offer tourists.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure that having you on the job, those standards will be met, judging by your track record.
Thank you.
I think we could finish by maybe giving a little nugget of advice. No, if you are listening to the podcast and you are now working on a project with moving parts, with red tape, with challengers, with different teams, different agendas, what kind of advice would you give someone who is in that situation on how to get things done?
Okay, well, in many cases, I'd say one has to think outside the box, because you will not be able to meet many of those targets, and sometimes I'm happy to give this advice to any of our colleagues out there, just because the most dangerous phrase in the civil service is it has always been done that way. Challenge that. I think many of us, especially the young ones, that will probably see that there's a better way of doing things. But unfortunately, the way big organizations are structured, we've got those who are set in their ways that stand above them. How do they do that without challenging egos? That's not easy. You don't want to go above your boss, but these are the challenges that you will face. Surround yourself with better people. That's a life skill. So they will make you better. Don't feel challenged because they know more than you. Learn from them. So we all have something to contribute. I think a big mistake is to be comfortable by having people that are perhaps less educated or don't take this. Don't. I always believe in getting people who are better. They will. Sometimes we don't want to hear it. Come on, I hear every day at home, but they will.
We have to leave our egos at the door when we come
absolutely.
into this place and try and be a team player.
Surround yourself with a better team. Some people that know more than you. You will grow there, and these are. I think that those are the main two key elements. But also there will be these times that you'll be knocked down and it's frustrating. I think it's a question that, look, take the hit, sleep on it. We all will learn from our mistakes.
Choose your battles.
Choose your battles. Just a conversation with that boss, with a teammate to say, okay, we had issues, let's clear them up. And I think setting that is also useful. And yes, I've now been in the civil service, is it now 25 years, 26? Ouch. And I'm happy to give that advice, whether it's on a technical front or how I've been able to manage. Because by driving change, you will always also be hated. People don't want that. So you've got to be careful also in choosing your battles, but also to be able to reconcile and find ways of moving forward. So once those battles are over. And I think that's something which I've learned. I've with many teams that I've had to work with, I still work with them. I've got a lot of time and appreciation for many of them, but I remember being at loggerheads, being in boardroom tables where we had a difference of opinion. I think Ian McLaren still remembers the water tanks. So I need to have, I've obviously now enjoyed my coffees with him once a month. Now he's retired, but we do go over those elements. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm sure it's been very useful, and thanks for all the hard work that you put in, the amazing projects that you're working on, and looking forward to talking about this in a few years with new projects and new ideas.
I'll do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anton.
Not another press release.